Hi. So today I'm talking about, or the first half of today, Augusto Boal, the proposition, the context in legislative theater using performance to make politics, and Sharon Rosenberg, neither forgotten nor fully remembered, tracing an ambivalent public memory on the 10th anniversary of the Montreal Massacre and Killing Women, the Visual Culture of Gender and Violence. I'm going to do, because I think that's going to take probably close to 10 minutes, and then I'll do the library one in another video. Basically, the one about legislative theater was about this guy from Buenos Aires who went to the Sorbonne and then got into theater and then started up doing Theater of the Oppressed stuff, and then he was invited by his politician friend to go back to Buenos Aires and start something there with the Theater of the Oppressed, and so he started, it was called like CTO, like the Center of the Theater of the Oppressed, and so he went there and they did some stuff, and it was working out, and then there was an election, and his friend didn't get elected again, or, yeah, I think it's a dude, Augusto? Yeah, probably a dude. And then they ran out of money and it couldn't be sustained because people because the people who they were interested in getting involved, I guess, didn't have a lot of money a lot of times, so they couldn't go without funding kind of thing. So it was kind of dying out. And then there was another election and they're like, you know what, let's put this to bed. We'll have like a big to-do. We'll go out kicking, right? So the way they're sort of like funeral dirge for the group, which was, and I'll explain that in a sec, was to run, like make it like a theater, because of the kind of theater they were doing where it was like a back and forth, so we're the actors, but it's he calls them participators or particactors. So they sort of set up scenarios and games and situations, and then the idea is that the audience interacts with them and gets involved, so that sort of fourth wall disintegrates. Which is a film term, but sorry. So they decide to run for like a counselor kind of position or like a parliament-esque thing there. They do go into like an extensive history of like Buenos Aires and what they were doing at the end of the article, but I'm not going to reiterate that here. And basically it was decided like, well, we should get a candidate and then do all these like theatrical like campaigning, because isn't campaigning and campaign sort of a theater, and it absolutely is, I agree. And so they did, and they decided that the guy who started it, this Augusto guy, he was going to be like the guy, and he was like, he made this big point of going on about how he didn't want to run for office, and he didn't want to interrupt his life, and he didn't want to be the center of it, and blah blah, and it was just like, he protested a little too much, you know? I don't know, it could be just sort of this antiquated way, of writing, like, well, it's not that antiquated if it's 10 years ago, but it's pretty antiquated maybe, but, so they did, and he won, and some stuff happened. So I like the idea of sort of treating politics as something to be subverted in a way that is constructive, which I think Theater of the Oppressed does, but I think that it's still, like, politically speaking, you're coming from, like, a point of privilege, and then you're interacting, it's sort of like a vanguard. I don't really see what the difference is between having like trained actors, theater people or whatever, or people who are starting the work, to lead other people to be particactors, to interact with them. You're still, do you know what I mean? Like it's nowhere as alienating as like elected officials and like the way our democratic system goes down. I'm not, you know what I mean? But it's still, I don't know if that is Theater of the Oppressed, you know, technically like the way I think of it. So it was a really interesting article though, and I think that in terms of like social movements and like political movements, that was like exactly apt, like it was exactly on point. So I thought it was really interesting reading. But I'm not exactly sure, I keep saying exactly, if I'm down, basically. And, yeah, that whole privilege thing sort of bothered me. What was the other thing I was thinking about? I'm trying to think. It seemed really French to me. I don't know. I've read some like translated French theory, like philosophical, like social theory and stuff like that, and it seemed very French to me. But I don't know if that was just me interpreting his education. And it was interesting. Look, his personality came out so much in the article that it was hard for me to ignore who this person was instead of it being about something broader. And in terms of an institution, I would much rather play with those guys than almost anybody else. And in terms of like getting into, it's total subversion. It's still like I agree. It's total subversion of the political process. They're like we're playing along. Like they dressed up. They did all these crazy things on the campaign trail that were really interesting and cool and participatory, and people came outside and did stuff, and it was interesting. So yeah, I would be interested. I always have these like images in my mind of like having marching bands interrupt classes or having stuff that was sort of like disruptive, but not in a sort of not thoughtless, because disruption. Um, I don't know. I don't know how I'm trying to say it. Like, um, in a really practical way. Like we're disrupting this for in a useful way, and the way we're doing it's important to what we're trying to say, or something like that. Like marching bands or dangling off buildings or occupying offices and that kind of thing, which at U of T does not have an acceptable history, frankly. Administrators really freak out if they can't go home at 4 o'clock. But as an aside, I thought it was interesting. I feel like I still have to mull over it some more, but I did think it was interesting. I'd heard the term theater of the oppressed, but I didn't really know what it meant. So there's that. The other one was the Montreal Massacre one, which was a weird article for me while I was reading it because it seemed to come from this place of privileging. Well, okay, first of all, the article is about how a public remembers and intakes tragedy or memory or has memories, right? Whether it's good or bad, I guess, right? And like what monuments have to do that. So as in terms of like the role of the artist, how you affect the public memory. So this is big stuff, right? This isn't like graffiti in an alley that like 10 people see in a week. So this is like monuments about big, like the Vietnam Memorial or these memorials that Sharon Rosenberg put up or made in Vancouver and Montreal and stuff about the Montreal Massacre, where a bunch of women were killed for being feminists specifically. Well, no, they were killed for being women because this guy was angry at feminists. So, and I remember, like, hearing about it when I was younger on the news and stuff, and I just didn't get it. I'm like, oh, that's really sad, but I didn't think it was more